Ahoy, mateys! Welcome to Podcasts of the Caribbean, a podcast covering the world of Pirates of the Caribbean, from the theme parks to the movies and everything in between. My name is Justin Helmer, and I will be your host on this voyage through the Caribbean. It'd be too late to alter course now, mateys. Hello, and welcome back to Podcast of the Caribbean. This is episode 26, and today we'll be continuing our voyage through Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides. So this is the second episode of Season 3. Of course, this season is devoted to covering the last two Pirates of the Caribbean movies, Pirates 4 and 5. We're currently making our way through On Stranger Tides currently. This is the second On Stranger Tides episode. If you haven't listened to the first episode on Stranger Tides, that one came out a few weeks ago. Make sure you go listen to that so you're caught up for this episode. And if you wanted to listen to episodes covering the first three movies or stuff about the theme park ride, comics, other stuff like that, you can go and check out our other episodes that we've done in the past on those films. But today, we're going to be continuing through On Stranger Tides. Of course, last episode we left off right after Joshamee Gibbs burned the Malkoon map, and he has now been taken aboard Barbossa's crew because Gibbs is probably the most useful person in the Pirates universe as of this moment, because he is the only person who knows pretty much everything on the Malkoon map, which is pretty crazy. But after that scene, we went back over to Jack Sparrow, who was asleep in a hammock, and we're going to find out where Jack has ended up right now. So let's get back into Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides. So we cut back to Jack Sparrow, who is asleep in this hammock here, and he gets woken up by this one pirate who's like, "Show a leg, sailor," and Jack falls to the ground, and he's like, "Aye, sir." Then he has a confused face. He's like, "What?" And then he's confused, he's not used to taking orders because he's used to being the captain. So this is almost a new experience for Jack Sparrow, or at least an experience he hasn't had in a very long time. But he gets up and starts talking to Scrum, who is back. Of course, we met Scrum last episode in The Captain's Daughter in London. But Jack turns to Scrum and he's like, there's been a horrible mistake. And then Scrum's like, "Keep moving." And Jack and Scrum are both carrying brooms and mops as they make their way through the decks of the ship that they're on. Jack turns to Scrum and he's like, "I'm not supposed to be here." And Scrum's like, "Many a man's woken up at sea with no idea what, when, wherefore, or why. No memory of the night before, once he signed up and drunk away all his bonus money." And then Jack's like, No, you don't understand me. I'm Captain Jack Sparrow, the original, the only." And Scrum's like, "Scrum, and the pleasure's all mine. Now keep moving." They start to swab the deck, and Jack turns around and he sees this massive glass coffin behind him. And he's like, "Scrum." And Scrum kind of hobbles over toward him. And Jack's like, "Why is there a glass coffin?" And Scrum's like, "Do I look like the man in charge?" And Jack's like, "Where am I?" And Scrum just says, "Excuse me, Captain Sparrow, sir. I'll be right honored to welcome you aboard our world-renowned vessel of infamy, Queen Anne's Revenge." And then Jack just freezes and just says, "Blackbeard." And then we get the great reveal of the Queen Anne's Revenge in the Pirates of the Caribbean universe. So, of course, the Queen Anne's Revenge is a real pirate ship that existed, of course, captained by Blackbeard. But it's just really cool to actually see this ship in the Pirates world. Because it's, when you think of the Queen Anne's Revenge, the real ship, it was probably just a normal ship, but of course for Pirates of the Caribbean, you can't just have a normal ship portraying one of the most infamous pirate ships of all time. You have to make it look unique and stand out, and I really love the design that they did on the Queen Anne's Revenge. It's very regal, but also terrifying at the same time. Because the sails are kind of like a blood red color. They're tattered. The hull of the ship is like this kind of burnt or like soggy dark wood color, and then throughout there's all these accents of gold, but they're muted gold. It's like a gold that has been worn over time, hasn't been like polished or kept up with. It's like it's eroding gold. So like on the back of the ship, there's a lot of really nice gold embellishments, and the two canopies on the side of the captain's cabin in the back, and then of course that gigantic stained glass window in the back of the ship. I love that so much. It's such a cool like detail to add to the ship. It makes it feel so grand. Like you look at the back of the ship and it looks so grand because you have the two canopies, the two balconies on the left and the right side of the ship, and then you have under that you have that kind of bottom balcony area that goes all the way around. It just is so striking and so visually beautiful, but also terrifying. Of course, there's also the figurehead of the skeleton with the spear and the cup. It's just a very, very regal, but like a terrifying regal ship, and it's very, very cool. I love the design of it. I think they did a really good job making it a unique ship in the Pirates universe, because of course you have to make something that doesn't feel like ships we've seen before. When you think about like pirate ships that we've seen in Pirates of the Caribbean, or like kind of like menacing ships, you think of the Black Pearl when we first saw it in Curse of the Black Pearl, when it was tattered and cursed and scary, with all the skeletons on it, and then of course the Flying Dutchman before the curse transferred over to Will and the kind of everything kind of fell off of the ship at the end of At World's End. The Flying Dutchman had this very gruesome tone to it as well, but it was more like it was weathered over time from being underwater. And I think the cool vibe that the Queen Anne's Revenge has is that it's a ship that's been at sea for so long and has had so much experience on it that is like a worn, weathered, like, I don't know, it's just a very cool vibe on the ship. And of course it's a very menacing and frightening ship, because of course it is the ship captained by Blackbeard, Edward Teach, who we'll get to meet kind of soon. But we progress on with the next scene where Scrum, Jack, and a lot of the pirates are swabbing the poop deck. Finally get to say that on this podcast. But Jack looks up and he sees this guy who just whipped Scrum to get back to work. And Jack's like, he's a curious one. And Scrum just says he's been zombified. And then we get a really good look at the gunner zombie. So, of course, one of the neat aspects they added into Blackbeard's character here is this kind of like voodoo zombie aspect, which is something we hadn't seen in Pirates of the Caribbean before. Of course, we've seen some voodoo stuff with Tia Dalma, like a little bit of it, but it's cool to see more of this kind of magic, or not really magic, but like this kind of curse or kind of thing like that, to have zombies in Pirates of the Caribbean. Of course, when you think of zombies, the first thing that comes to your mind is like, rotting remains, like Walking Dead, like stuff like that. But I do like the way they have the zombies in here, how they're still pretty normal looking, but they're zombified in the way that you can see kind of things that are like put into them, or like weird kind of facial features or different like things on their bodies, and that they are completely obedient to Blackbeard, and they're very cruel and menacing, and I like that approach, and it is neat to see zombies in the Pirates world as well, which is one of the cool aspects of this movie and one of the things I like a lot about it. But of course we have the gunner zombie here, who is very neat, very cool, love his design, and Jack's like, "Hey," and Scrum says, "Zombified." Blackbeard's doing, "All the officers are the same. Makes them more compliant." And then we get, the gunner zombie, he whips another pirate right after Scrum says that. And Jack just says, "And perpetually ill-tempered." And then the gunner zombie turns around and looks at Jack, and we get a really good look at the gunner zombie's face. How you can kind of see the markings and the patterning on his face. How his one eye is kind of like not like sewn shut, but it's kind of like it's shut, and there's like this kind of like traced pattern going out of the side of it. Like it's kind of like this like thread that's woven through his face. It's a really neat design. And it's kind of the stuff on the bottom of his chin as well. The rings coming out of his chin. It's a really neat design, a really cool concept, I think. But of course, Scrum tries to get Jack back to work and says, "Come on, scrub." And Jack's like, "Yeah." And they get back to swabbing the poop deck. Then we have another cool view of the bow of the Queen Anne's Revenge, and we see Blackbeard's flag in Pirates of the Caribbean. So obviously, Blackbeard's flag in real life is very different than Blackbeard's flag in Pirates of the Caribbean. So in real life, Blackbeard's pirate flag was this kind of like skeletal, almost demon. It has like two horns at the top of its head, holding the cup and holding the spear, which you may actually notice is actually the figurehead of the Queen Anne's Revenge in Pirates of the Caribbean. So it's cool how they adapted the original flag and made that into the figurehead instead. I think it's a really neat little concept there. But this skeletal demon is pointing the spear at this heart on the flag, and there's like kind of like, I guess, droplets of blood is supposed to be coming out on the end. It's a really neat flag. I think it's probably one of the most iconic pirate flags of all time. When you're talking about famous pirates and their flags, it probably is one of the most iconic ones of all time. And it's a very striking flag, and obviously it is interesting that they changed it to what it is in Pirates of the Caribbean, where it's mainly just this kind of hellish skull with flames coming out on the two sides, or kind of like these strokes that almost look like flames, which we'll see in a little bit why there's flames all over the ship, pretty much. But yeah, I feel like they changed it to match more with the version of Blackbeard that they put in this movie. But it is cool to see the original flag adapted into the figurehead instead. So that's really cool. Then we keep going with this montage of Jack, Scrum, and the rest of the crew of the Revenge, just doing duties on deck. So we have a bunch of pirates who are pulling the rigging and pulling the sails up. We get to see some other characters who will be semi-important throughout the movie here. So we see the cabin boy, and we see some other characters like Solomon and other pirates here as well. Here's Solomon coming up right here, but he is helping Jack and Scrum here, and Jack says 5 days underway at least, and then Scrum's like, you can tell that by the smell of the sea, and Jack's like, no, by the smell of the crew. And he bends down, and he looks up, and he sees this man who is tied to the mast. And Jack says to Scrum, he's like, "Oi, what did that poor sod do? And how can I make sure to not?" And Scrum's like, "Him, churchly fellow, always going on about the Lord Almighty." And then Jack's like, "Bible thumper on this ship?" And then Scrum says a missionary is his story. And then while Scrum is saying this, Jack kind of bends down and gets some water or soup or something from the cook right here as well. And Scrum continues and says, "What I heard was that he got captured in a raid. Rest of the ship got killed, but not him. First mate wouldn't let it happen, on account of his premier standing with the Lord. A first mate sticking her neck out for some prisoner." And then Scrub's like, "That you don't see." And Jack stops him. He's like, "Her? First mate is a her?" Before we continue, of course, this is our introduction to Philip Swift, who is a missionary, and of course he is a neat supporting character in this film. Of course, on the last episode, I told you all about my very young cringe theory about how Philip Swift was Will Turner's son. I really liked Philip Swift back in the day. He's still a neat character, but I liked him a lot just because he looked like Will Turner. That's why I always assumed he was his son. But also, I was 9 years old at the time. But yeah, he's a cool character. But yeah, when I think of Philip Swift, I just think back to that, and I'm like, man, how did I really think about? How did I think that? But of course, Jack says her. First mate is a her. And of course, one of the zombies yells for them to get back to work, and Jack turns around, and he sees through the hole in the sail. He sees Angelica standing up right in front of the helm. And the realization hits him, and he's like, "Oh, that is how I'm here." Of course, you remember back in London, when Jack and Angelica got out of the captain's daughter, Jack got hit by a blow dart by the quartermaster zombie and passed out. So it starts rushing back, and Jack now knows what is going on pretty much. But I really like this footage of actually seeing the Queen Anne's Revenge at sea, because I mean, it's not like this was actually CGI. This was actually filmed on the open water. At least many of these scenes on the Queen Anne's Revenge were filmed on open water. I'll bring this up now. I brought it up last episode as well, but this film was filmed on location mostly, which was really, really cool. And obviously you can tell by the locales and everything. It's all real. And the Queen Anne's Revenge here, they kind of did the same thing that they did with Pirates 2 and 3, how they built, the Black Pearl and the Flying Dutchman on barges. And what's interesting about the Queen Anne's Revenge, it is built on a boat, on a barge, but it is actually the Black Pearl. There is actually a whole featurette on the Blu-ray that is how they took the Black Pearl that they built in Pirates 2 and 3 on that boat, and they completely redesigned that Black Pearl into the Queen Anne's Revenge. So it is kind of sad when I watched it recently to kind of bring back some information and some memories, but it was sad seeing the Black Pearl get transformed into the Queen Anne's Revenge. But yeah, so that is some neat insight for you if you didn't know. So the Black Pearl they used in 2 and 3 is actually the Queen Anne's Revenge here, so it's really cool. So it is a seafaring ship, just like the Black Pearl and the Flying Dutchman were in Pirates 2 and 3, and that's why I love seeing this open sea footage, because you can tell it was filmed on the ocean. Unlike Pirates 5, as much as I like Pirates 5, it has many faults, which we'll go over when we get to that movie, including the fact that most of the film was filmed in front of a blue screen. Which I get, movies are getting very, very expensive, especially movies like these. But man, you can tell that it wasn't filmed on the water, in Pirates 5. Anyway, that's beside the point. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But we get a really nice overview of the whole Queen Anne's Revenge as the camera sweeps over it. Then we go over to this next scene where Angelica goes below deck. And is grabbed by Jack, and he puts a hook around her neck, and he says, "You are a ruthless, soulless, cross-grained cur." And Angelica says, "I told you I had a ship." And Jack's like, "No, Blackbeard has a ship, upon which I am now imprisoned." And Angelica's like, "We can do this, Jack. The fountain of youth, like you always wanted." And Jack's like, "Blackbeard, Edward Teach, the pirate all pirates fear, resurrector of the dead in his spare time." And Angelica says, "He will listen to me." And Jack's like, "He listens to no one." And Angelica just says, "Maybe to his own daughter." And Jack kind of stops for a second, it's like, "What?" And Jack's like, "Daughter as in beget by?" And Angelica clarifies and says, "Long lost, recently found, who loves her dear papa with all her soul." And then Jack's like, "He bought that?" And Angelica's like, "I sold that." And then Jack hears someone coming down the stairs, so he grabs Angelica, and they both run over to cover in the corner of the room as they see the quartermaster zombie come down the stairs. Of course, before we move on, let's talk about Blackbeard is the father of Angelica, or I should say, Angelica is the daughter of Blackbeard in this universe, which is a really neat concept. It is a cool idea. I think it's executed pretty well in this film. Having Angelica be Edward Teach's daughter. Of course, up to this point, we haven't really been calling her Angelica Teach. I did say, I think, at the beginning of the first episode, but yeah, Angelica Teach. I mean, what more can you really say? It's a thing. So it is cool. It's a neat concept, and it kind of ties into the whole plot and everything kind of moving forward. They kind of needed something like this to kind of have what's about to go on. But of course, up to this point, we were, people at least would suspect that Angelica was getting Jack to help her so they could both get the fountain. But of course, now Jack realizes that Angelica got Jack so they could use Jack's help to get to the fountain, and it's a fountain of youth for Blackbeard and her, and not for her and Jack. As Jack clarifies in just a second, then it's the fountain of youth for him, or him and you, not you and me. And then Angelica says, "No, Jack, that's the best part. He will be dead." And then Jack's like, you'll be handling that part yourself then. And Angelica says, "There's a prophecy. Maybe you don't believe in the supernatural." And then Jack's like, "Oh, no, I've seen a thing or two." And it's also funny how she says this. Meanwhile, there's like undead zombies just walking around the ship. Like, that makes no sense. Of course, Jack has seen a lot of interesting things happen to him throughout his life, over time. But I should also clarify when this really takes place in the timeline for Pirates of the Caribbean. Of course, the Pirates of the Caribbean timeline, like actual, like getting years to kind of go with dates and movies, it's very hard. It's like, it's clarified and then it's completely not true. And then there's a whole different kind of concept. But thankfully the Pirates Wiki has kind of given a pretty decent overview of established time frames and also, educated guesses for different years. So of course, Dead Man's Chest and At World's End, they both take place, back to back. But On Stranger Tides is supposed to kind of take place around like the late 1740s, early 1750s. So this is like 10 plus years after At World's End. Let's just, talk about that. Like, it's not like At World's End happened and then boom, like a month or two later, Jack Sparrow ends up in London. Like, this is like like a decade after At World's End, which is pretty crazy. How we don't really know anything that happened to Jack or like anyone else during that time period. Like, that there is so much time there that is completely like not really clarified on. Like, that's like 10 to 20 years for, like, depending on how you look at it, like what years you used in your headcanons, but like we could be like potentially like 15, 20 years from the end of At World's End here. Like, that's what's really interesting. I think it's crazy that like there's such a big time jump from At World's End to this movie, and it's not clarified or spoken about obviously in the movie. I don't think years are really ever mentioned, like specifically in the movie. Of course, if they were, then we would have a really good idea of when things take place. But like, that's just crazy to me. Like, to think that Jack has been looking, in quotation marks, for the Fountain of Youth for like 15 years is pretty crazy. All this stuff has, taken years to, like, it's really interesting to think about just what happened during that time period between At World's End and this movie, we will never know. But there's so much time that passed, and we'll just never know. But anyway, back to the movie. But Angelica begins to tell Jack the prophecy about Blackbeard, and this is something I really like. We won't really dwell on it too long, but of course it'll come back to haunt us as we get farther into the movie. But Angelica tells Jack Blackbeard will meet his death within a fortnight, that's 2 weeks, at the hands of a one-legged man. Which is really cool. And obviously, when you hear, one-legged man, you instantly think, oh, what other one-legged man is there right now than Barbossa? Obviously, we know Barbossa only has one leg now because he lost his leg defending the Pearl, as we will later find out. But I really like this prophecy. I think it's neat, and kind of how it's like foretold, or like it's destiny that Barbossa is going to come for Blackbeard, and for why we will find out also very soon. But Angelica says that's why he needs the fountain, Jack. And Angelica walks away, leaves Jack alone, and then we head right over to the HMS Providence, which is our British Royal Navy ship in this film, which is cool to see again. And of course, this is Privateer Barbossa's ship. So we see Gibbs is kind of thrown on deck next to Barbossa. And Barbossa's like, "Oh, Master Gibbs, short we are a map. Perhaps you'd be so kind as to provide us with a heading." And Gibbs goes over to the charts that Barbossa has laid out. And I love how he looks over at Groves and he's like, "Be a gem and pour me a gulper." And then Barbossa's like, "Nay, we be privateers, not pirates, Master Gibbs. And in the king's name we behave as such." And then Gibbs is like, "Aye, Captain." And Gibbs kind of just looks at the map. He looks out at the sea for a little bit. And, of course, Barbossa's getting frustrated. And Barbossa's like, "Be we on the proper course, Gibbs?" And then Gibbs says, "Aye, it be proper." And then he points behind Barbossa and he says, "There's your proof." And then Barbossa, Gillette, and Groves, they turn around and they see on the horizon a Spanish galleon. And not just one Spanish galleon, but multiple Spanish galleons out on the sea behind the Providence. So, of course, Barbossa sees these and he says, "All hands, battle stations, get to windward." And we have, of course, everyone getting ready. We have the drummers are starting to drum and everything. People running out the guns, muskets, all kinds of things. But we see these 3 Spanish galleons that are passing by the Providence. And, of course, everyone is expecting these Spanish galleons to fire on the Providence. So the gunners are grabbing their muskets. They're getting on the cannons, getting the cannons loaded, getting everything ready. And Barbossa just says, "Await orders," and he looks out at the Spanish galleons as they continue to float by. And Groves says, "Guns armed, awaiting orders, sir." And he grabs the spyglass from Groves, he looks through it, and he sees the Spaniard on one of the ships. As he is looking at the ships, Groves just says again, "Sir, orders, sir." Honestly, if you think about it, a nice callback to when Groves was constantly asking Beckett for orders on the Endeavor right before Beckett and the Endeavor went down into the ocean at the end of At World's End. So I think Groves is just, at this point, he's so jumpy because he's like, okay, if we don't act for a second time, I am just going to be done. Like, I'm just so done. But, of course, Barbossa just stands there and just does nothing as he notices that the Spanish are just passing them by. And Barbossa, he just puts his spyglass away, and Gibbs just says he never so much as turned his head. And Barbossa says to Groves, "The fountain is the prize." It appears we not even be worth the time it take to sink us. And now we've fallen behind. All hands, make more sail. And everyone, of course, who was in gunning position, put their stuff away, and they go back to getting the ship ready to move again. And Barbossa grabs the helm and he says, "Ride hard between wind and tide." Then we go back over to the Queen Anne's Revenge at night, at dusk, I should say. And I love this kind of silhouette of the Queen Anne's Revenge with all the lanterns. There's so many lanterns. There's a lot of fire on this ship, as we'll come to see. Also the cage. I didn't talk about this before. The big kind of cage on the back, on the stern of the Queen Anne's Revenge. I keep wanting to say the Flying Dutchman for some reason. The big gibbet cage on the stern of the Revenge, also kind of terrifying if you really think about it. And then we go down to below deck where Jack is lighting a candle. And he says to all these pirates who are gathered around him, he says, "The topic, gentlemen, is mutiny. Mutiny, most foul." And Solomon says, I signed up to sail under Jack Sparrow, not some pretender." They end a lady at that. And the cook says, "And mention was failed to be made of this uncanny crew. Make my toes curl, they do." And then as they're talking, the cabin boy comes over to this group, and he has all these swords, and he lays them down on the table. He's like, "I got them, all of them." And he's like, "Well done, good lad." And then Jack's like, "On to it then, Blackbeard. What are his habits?" And then Scrum's like, "Stays mostly to his cabin." And he's like, "That's right, mostly to," and they're all like, "That's right, mostly to his cabin." Da, da, da. And then Jack's like, "Yes, but he when he comes out." And the cabin boy is like, "He doesn't really come out." And everyone's like, no. And then Jack's like, "He must come out sometime." And then everyone's like, "No, really, no. And then Jack's like, "Any of you sail with him before?" And then everyone's like, no, definitely not, never. And then Jack's like, "Any of you seen him before?" And then it's like, "No, not really, no. And then Jack's like, stays to his cabin, no one sailed with him, no one's seen him. Good news, gentlemen. This is not Blackbeard's ship. This is not the Queen Anne's Revenge." And then Scrum's like, no, this be the Queen Anne's Revenge, right enough. And then Jack's like, "How do you know?" And then Scrum's like, "I've seen the name on the back of the ship." And Jack just looks at him and just rolls his eyes. And Jack just goes on. He's like, "Gentlemen, sirs, fellow conscriptees, you have been monstrously deceived." And Solomon's like, "We are decepted then." And Jack's like, "Yes." "You've nay been informed of a destination. Death lies before us as we sail for the Fountain of Youth." I remember that line was also in the trailers as well. But Jack continues going on. He says, "It would be a sorry plight, mates." And the pirates are like, "Death, for certain, the garden of darkened souls. Untimely our ends will be." And then Jack's like, "Unless we take the ship." And Scrum just, he jumps up quickly, he grabs his sword and stabs it into the table. He's like, "We take the ship then, now!" And he runs away. And Jack's just sitting there, and he just looks at everyone. He's like, "Go on then." And then everyone's like, "Yeah!" And they grab the swords and they all start running up deck to start the mutiny. And then we see Scrum and all these pirates like, "Wake up, it's ours, come on!" They're waking everybody up to get this mutiny going. As they head up deck, you can see everyone's grabbing weapons or grabbing swords and everything. And as they head up to start the mutiny, Jack goes over to deal with Angelica. So he goes over into Angelica's cabin, and she is asleep in her bed. Jack has his sword out, and maybe he had the intention of wanting to kill her just to get rid of her, but he drops that idea and he just lays down in bed next to her. I guess also to just distract her. But Angelica like kind of wakes up or is like half awake, and she's like, Jack, if this is a dream, you can keep this sword and boots on. But she continues like, if it's not, and then Jack's like, it's a dream. Then we go right out to the deck of the Queen Anne's Revenge, where all the pirates are now fighting the zombies, who are pretty much their only opposition. Because, I mean, who else is really loyal to Blackbeard that aren't just the zombies? So it's pretty much the whole crew up against the zombies, which you would think would be an easy fight, but we find out soon enough that these zombies are way tougher than you would think. We then go back over to Angelica and Jack in the bed, and once Angelica starts hearing all of the noise outside, she wakes up and she's like, no, it's not. And then she throws Jack out of bed, and Jack's like, I thought I should give you fair warning, we're taking the ship. And then Jack's like, nothing personal, and Angelica's yelling behind him in Spanish. And then Jack's he walks out and he closes the door behind him. He's like, think you might just be better off if you just... And then he just sees Angelica's sword come through the door right next to his face. And Jack's just like, stay out of it. And then we go back out on deck where we see all the pirates fighting the zombies. Where we see a bunch of zombies that we actually don't really see that much for the rest of the movie. Which is neat. You can see there's actually a pretty decent amount of them. But then we have this scene of one of the pirates stabbing the quartermaster zombie through the heart. And all we see is the quartermaster pulls out this sword, and he's completely fine. No blood, no nothing. So we can see these zombies aren't going down easily. They aren't going to go down just with normal weapons, obviously. We see Jack making his way back up to... making his way to the upper deck, and he sees the gunner zombie, and he's like, bugger. And then he engages in this fight with the gunner zombie as he tries to get out of there and makes his way to the stairs. He trips the gunner and runs up the stairs to get away. And dodges the gunner's axe right as he makes it up the stairs. And as you can see, a really, really great fight scene here on the deck of the Queen Anne's Revenge. We see Angelica comes up, and now she is some more opposition to the rest of the crew of the Queen Anne's Revenge here. But Jack is not doing too well against all these zombies. More likely the gunner zombie, who he's currently in this fight with. But he's saved, thankfully, by Solomon, who throws a net over the gunner zombie. And kind of gets Jack out of the way. And Jack looks up at Philip, who is still, of course, tied onto the mast, and he nods to Solomon. And him and Solomon begin to climb up the rigging to get to the mast, to get to Philip. And then we have some more fighting here, especially with Angelica. I really love her fighting style. It is very, very nice. We get to Jack and Solomon, who have reached Philip on the top of the mast here. And Solomon points his knife at Philip. He's like, you're either with us or against us. And then Philip says, I'm not with you, neither am I against you. And then Solomon, he looks at Jack. He's like, can he do that? And then Jack's like, he's religious. I believe it's required. But Jack cuts Philip's ropes and sets him free. And they make their way back down to the deck. And Jack just says, fight to the bitter end, you cat-kind deck apes. But the quartermaster zombie sees Jack, and he makes his way toward him. But Jack runs up these stairs as he's fighting the quartermaster, and then he pushes the quartermaster off the stairs, and some of the pirates grab him and tie him onto this. They tie his arms to this mop, and then put him against the mast to kind of incapacitate him, which is really the best you can do when you can't kill the enemy. But Jack makes it up to the balcony here, as pretty much it seems like everything is going their way. It seems like Angelica has now been has now been captured. All the zombies are kind of been tied down or like held down, and Jack just says triumphantly, "The ship is ours!" And right behind him, the doors open up, and Jack turns around, and we see a shadow of a man walking out of this cabin. So, of course, if you think about it, the whole scene, no one has seen Blackbeard. No one knows what he looks like. And they were all, of course, under the impression that this wasn't even Blackbeard's ship. But now they're about to be proven dead wrong. And we finally get the reveal of Ian McShane as Captain Edward Teach. And I really think he did a great job in this film. He is a really menacing character, and I think Ian portrayed that very, very well. This specific version of Blackbeard, of course. I think Ian McShane did a very good job portraying Blackbeard in this film. But of course, once the crew sees Blackbeard come out, they all just get very scared, and they let go of all the zombies. They just let them go. Angelica gets free, and they're at this point they're like, well, we're done. We're done for. We're done for. There's no way we're getting out of this one. But Blackbeard just kind of looks around really quick, and he just says, "Gentlemen." And he takes a swig of rum, and he throws the bottle down on the deck, and it crashes and smashes right in front of Jack, as Jack's kind of just like nonchalantly walking down the stairs. And Blackbeard just says, "I be placed in a bewilderment. There I were, resting. And upon a sudden, I hear an ungodly row on deck." And we can see Blackbeard puts his hand on the pommel of his sword, which is the Sword of Triton, by the way. If you did not know the name of Blackbeard's sword, it does become very important in this film and also Dead Men Tell No Tales. So let's say right now, the name of Blackbeard's sword is the Sword of Triton. That is the official name that it was given. And it's such a cool sword, like design-wise. It's so, so cool. I'll talk about it a bit more once we actually see more of it in action. But as he puts his hand on the pommel of the sword, we get this shot of the ropes from around the ship beginning to slither and move, which is very eerie. But Blackbeard continues what he was saying, and he's like, "Sailors abandon their post, without orders, without leave. Men before the mast, taking the ship for themselves." But Jack begins to notice all these ropes and the rigging and everything. They're starting to move. And Blackbeard just says, "What be that, first mate?" And Angelica just says, "Mutiny, captain." And Blackbeard says, "Again?" And Angelica just shouts, "Mutiny!" And Blackbeard's like, "Aye, mutiny." And then we see a shot of one of the ropes slithering on the deck like a snake, which is really cool. And then Blackbeard he grips the handle of the Sword of Triton, and he says, "And what fate befalls mutineers? Now, I believe we know the answer to that, don't we? Mutineers, hang!" And he raises the sword in the air, and the sails, they drop down, and then he thrusts the sword out in front of him, and all the ropes begin to grab all the crew members. They tangle around them, and they pull them up and bring them all around the ship. So we just see Scrum, he gets wrapped around his stomach and gets shot up into the air. We see a great montage of all these pirates getting pulled by the leg, they're just getting ropes tied around them all over the place and getting strung up and tied up into the rigging above the ship. We see one of the pirates tries to jump off the ship, but the rigging snatches him and drags him right back onto it. And pretty much everyone is now tied up. We get this really great shot of everyone just tied into the rigging in the air of the ship, just dangling, which is really, I think it's a really neat concept. And then right after this, we then see Blackbeard with the sword of Triton in hand, and he just kind of stands there. And right after that, we see Jack Sparrow just get dangled right in front of Blackbeard, and Jack just says, "Captain, I wish to report a mutiny. I can name fingers and point names." And then Blackbeard's like, "No need, Mr. Sparrow. They are sheep, you their shepherd." And then he sheaths the sword of Triton, and Jack falls to the deck of the Queen Anne's Revenge. And Blackbeard begins to walk down toward Jack, and Jack just says, "Have I mentioned, sir, what a lovely daughter you have?" And Blackbeard just walks over to Jack. He pulls out his pistol, and he's like, "A fitting last sight for a doomed soul." And he gets ready to shoot Jack, but Angelica stops him and says, "Remember, father, we need him." And Blackbeard just says to Angelica, he's like, "If I don't kill a man every so often, they forget who I am." And then we hear someone say "coward" from over on the deck of the ship, and then Blackbeard's like, "Hmm?" And then we see Philip Swift, who is actually the one who was spared. He wasn't strung up in the rigging, mainly probably because he didn't take a side. But Philip kind of goes on this rant here. It's like, "They do not forget. Your crew sees you for the miscreant you are. A coward, no matter how many you slay." And then the quartermaster zombie stops Philip from going any farther. And then Blackbeard's like, "Twice in one day I find myself in a bewilderment." And then Philip says, "You are not bewildered, you are afraid. You dare not walk the path of righteousness, the way of the light." And Blackbeard walks over to Philip, and he says, "No, sir, the truth is it that'd be much simpler than all that. I'm just a bad man." And Philip's like, "That too." And then Blackbeard's like, "I might have to kill you too, catechist." And he raises his pistol at Philip. And then Angelica is like, "No," and she throws his arm down, and Blackbeard's like, "Oh, Latin blood like your mother." And Angelica's like, "Father, I beg you." And then Blackbeard's like, "There I be again, forgetting why the missionary is here. My daughter fears for my soul, or what's left of it." "You truly wish to save me, my child?" And Angelica, of course, says, every soul can be saved. And then Blackbeard's like, "Be that true, young cleric?" And then Philip says, "Yes, though you I see as a bit of a long shot. Still I pray for every unfortunate soul aboard this hellbound vessel." And Blackbeard just says, "You disarm me with your faith." And then he puts his pistol back into his belt. And he says, "8 bells! Which of you unfortunate souls stood watch?" And Jack sits up. He's like, "I did. I stood watch." And Blackbeard laughs at him. He's like, "Gunner?" And the gunner zombie just looks up at the cook. And Blackbeard just says, "You." And the cook's like, "I." And then Blackbeard's like, "I. The cook. Perfect. Lower the longboat." And then we go over to the cook, who is now in this longboat, out at sea, trying to row away from the Queen Anne's Revenge. And then we see Blackbeard on the bow of the ship. He says, "Bring her about." And the quartermaster zombie begins to kind of shift the ship over to follow the cook, who is in front of the ship trying to row away to save his life. And you can see that this one shot that we see, the cook seems like he's very far away from the Queen Anne's Revenge. But I guess he's way closer than it looks. Maybe it's just perspective. I don't know. There's one shot that it just looks like he's like so far out from the ship. Maybe it's just perspective. But the cook is trying to do his best to row away as quick as possible, as quick as he can. And then Angelica is like, "Why do you do this?" And then Blackbeard's like, "Mutiny, our laws be clear." And Angelica's like, "Our laws allow the captain to show leniency." And then Blackbeard says, "I have given this man a chance to determine his fate. A gift not afforded to all." And then, of course, we get the notion that something's going to happen. We see a lot of fire beginning to kind of prep itself on the bow, the Queen Anne's Revenge. And then Philip walks up next to Blackbeard, and Blackbeard's like, "Oh, you now. Chance to show the worth of your prayers. Pray he be delivered from evil." Then we see the Queen Anne's Revenge. I guess it's just moving fast. It's encroaching on the cook faster than he can row. He's not going to be able to get away. But once the ship hits like the angle that Blackbeard wants, he raises his arm and says, "Course made," and Philip tries to stop him in this moment, and Philip's like, "Stop, give that man a chance, give yourself a chance." And then out of nowhere, two gigantic plumes of fire burst out from the bow of the Queen Anne's Revenge, and they just completely engulf the cook and the longboat in flames. And the cook is dead. There's no way you could survive that. Then we just get, looks at, everyone witnessing this cruel, horrible act that Blackbeard has just committed. Where we see, the burning longboat in front of the ship. And Angelica, of course, walks away. She can't take any more of it. But Philip is still there, watching in horror. And Blackbeard says something to him, and he says, "You know when I feel closest to our Maker? When I see suffering, pain, and anguish, that's when the true design of this world is revealed." And then Philip clashes back, and he's like, "And I see it revealed when in times of hardship and tragedy, kindness and compassion are shown to those in need." And then Blackbeard says to him, "Perhaps you should pray for him to be unharmed, yes?" And then Philip's like, "Please, there's still hope." And Blackbeard says again, and the fire shoots out again, and burns the rest of whatever's left of the longboat and the cook. And of course, Jack and the rest of the crew are watching this in horror. And then we go over to a scene in Blackbeard's cabin, where Jack is brought in, and the quartermaster zombie pins Jack to this beam with a knife. He pins his shirt to the beam, so Jack pretty much can't go anywhere. And Jack's like, "I actually have no interest in the fountain whatsoever. So if your heart is set, you may drop me off anywhere you like." And then Blackbeard just says, "That'll be all, quartermaster." And the quartermaster leaves the cabin and leaves Blackbeard and Jack alone together. And Blackbeard says to Jack, he's like, "Your words surround you like a fog and make you hard to see." And Jack's like, "And what of you, the mighty Blackbeard? Beheaded, they say. Still your body swam 3 times around your ship, then climbed back on board. And here you are, running scared." And before we move on, let's talk about that. If you're familiar with pirate myths and pirate lore, like real life stuff, the common myth about the death of Blackbeard was that he was killed by this guy named Robert Maynard, and he was beheaded. So Robert Maynard, he killed Blackbeard. He cut Blackbeard's head off, and as the story goes, Maynard hung Blackbeard's head on the jib of his ship to kind of scare off any other pirates or anyone that would try to challenge him. That's kind of the story of how Blackbeard was killed. If that story is completely true, no one will really know. But that's kind of the most popular, most common answer when someone says, "How did Blackbeard die?" But that's really the main kind of myth of the death of Blackbeard. And it's cool that it's alluded to in this film. Of course, in real life, Blackbeard died way before this movie is supposedly supposed to take place. This movie, of course, as I said, is supposed to kind of be in the late 1740s, maybe early 1750s, depending on how you look at things. Blackbeard supposedly died in 1718, which is like 30 years before this movie takes place. So, of course, I like how they took kind of Blackbeard's real life death, and they kind of wove it into here and kind of have this myth about, oh, he got beheaded like the stories go, but his head like swam around the ship and came up back on deck, and he's still alive. So I like how they have that kind of version of the myth. So they have the kind of the real life thing, and they add on this extra part of the myth as well, which I think is kind of cool. But Blackbeard, of course, Jack said that he's running scared. And Blackbeard's like, scared. And then Jack just says, to the fountain. And Blackbeard says, the quartermaster sees things before they happen. He has foreseen my death, and so the fates have spoken. The threads of destiny woven. And then Jack says, you have a ridiculously high regard for fate, mate. And Blackbeard says, and you? And Jack's like, me? I'm skeptical of predicting any future, which includes me. And then of course, Blackbeard is now sitting at his desk, and he's kind of distracted by, the papers that he's looking at. So Jack kind of takes this opportunity to try to grab the knife that is holding him to the post, and try to free himself. So as Jack tries to grab this knife, Blackbeard continues, and he says, it'd be foolish to battle fate, but I'd be tempted to cheat it. But Jack is successful, and he pulls out the knife from the post, and we can see that he has his mind is set on trying to kill Blackbeard here, with this knife. But as Jack kind of tries to walk over toward him, Blackbeard says, I will reach the fountain, you will lead me. And Jack readies the knife in his hand. He walks over to Blackbeard's desk, and then without even looking up, Blackbeard just says, that knife will serve you no better than the mutiny you devised. And then Jack kind of just shrugs it off and says, mutiny served me well. It gained me an audience with you. And then Blackbeard's like, oh. And then Jack's like, I. To warn you. And he stabs the knife in front of Blackbeard. And he says, regarding your first mate, who pretends to be persons she is not. And then Blackbeard's like, do tell. And then Jack just says, she is not your daughter. And then we get this quick shot of Angelica kind of eavesdropping on Jack and Blackbeard's conversation from outside of the cabin. And Blackbeard says, you dare to speak thusly of my flesh and blood. And then Jack's like, sir, the woman is consummate in the art of deception. I know, as I mostly unwittingly set her on her wicked path. And he's like, though I cannot claim credit for her existing abundance of natural talent. And then we get the reveal of the Jack Sparrow voodoo doll, which we'll come into contact with a few times in this movie. But it's really neat. But as Blackbeard holds the voodoo doll in his hands, he says, Angelica, my beloved daughter, the one true good thing I have done in this life, and you claim to be the one who corrupted her? And then Jack's like, sir, what she is pure evil. More to be feared than a wild beast. Hungry and wild beast with gnashing teeth. Vengeful, hungry from hell beast. And then Angelica just comes into the cabin, and Jack's like, sweetness. And then Blackbeard grabs the knife and stabs it into the Jack Sparrow voodoo doll. And Jack feels it. He feels like he's been stabbed. And then Angelica's like, no need to hurt him, father. He will help us. Won't you, Jack? And then Blackbeard's like, you see, even now she attends to your welfare, giving lie to the claims you make of her. And we can see Blackbeard kind of carve something into the voodoo doll's chest. And he pulls the knife out, and Jack kind of staggers back to the wall. And Jack looks at his chest, and he sees that Blackbeard has carved into him this kind of like trident-looking shape. Or kind of like a pitchfork, maybe. Like a pitchfork kind of shape into his chest. Kind of obviously gets Jack's attention, because now Jack realizes that he's playing with powers that are greatly above what he can handle on his own, of course. But Angelica just says, "You will lead us to the fountain." Yes. And then Blackbeard's like, "Put another way. If I do not make it to the fountain in time," then as he says this, he holds the Jack Sparrow voodoo doll over the candle on his desk, and it kind of starts to smolder the fabric hair of the voodoo doll. We see Jack, he starts to feel the heat on his head, and he puts his hands up to his head because he can feel like his head's on fire. But Blackbeard says, "Neither will you." And then Jack, is currently going some crazy pain right now. And Jack just says, I'll have a wee look-see at those charts straight away then, shall I? And then after that scene, we go over to the Providence again, and we see that Barbossa is enjoying some leisurely time eating some apple slices. So, of course, we still got Barbossa and the apple. He's just eating an apple more civilized. Because he's just eating. He's, like, using the very small fork and, like, sticking it into the apple slice. And Groves comes up to him and he's like, "Sir." And then Barbossa just eats one of the apple slices. And he's like, "I?" And then Groves like, "Captain, sir. I am unhappy to report rumors, sir, among the crew as to our destination." And then I love how Barbossa, he just turns to Groves and says, "Shut your trap and make way." And Groves just sighs. And then Barbossa stands up and turns around to Groves and he says, "That's the way of it then." And then Groves is like, "No disrespect, sir." And then Barbossa's like, "What do the men fear? Say it, speak the words." And then Groves just says, "White Cap Bay." And then he kind of like kicks Groves out of the way with his crutch. And he's like, "Aye, White Cap Bay. And every worthless seaman fears the name, and rightly so, though few know why or dare to ask." And then Gibbs comes up from the crew. The whole crew is listening in on Barbossa here, but Gibbs comes up and he's like, "Be the stories true?" And Barbossa says, Say what robs you of your staunch heart, Gibbs, or if leave it to the wider fields of fancy." And then Gibbs just says, "Mermaids, Captain." And then Barbossa just says, "Aye, mermaids." And then the whole crew is like, "Mermaids," like, "Whoa, oh my god, mermaids, oh." And Barbossa continues, like, "Seagulls, devilfish, dreadful and hunger for flesh of man. Mermaid waters, that be our path. Cling to your soul, Gibbs, as mermaids be given to take the rest. To the bone." The crew all gets scared here, and Groves yells at, like, "Steady, steady, man, find your courage. We'll be ready to purpose your fear." And then one of the crewmen, he starts to run on the deck. He's like, "Save yourselves!" And he jumps overboard into the water. And then the whole crew's like, "Man overboard!" And then Barbossa immediately stops him. He's like, "Nay, a deserter." And Groves is like, "Come about." And Barbossa's like, "Nay. Gentlemen, I shall not ask any more of any man than what that man can deliver, but I do ask this. Are we not king's men?" And there's like a very like kind of silent like, "Aye, aye, aye." And then Barbossa continues like, "On the king's mission," and they get louder this time. They're like, "Aye." And then Barbossa says, "I did not note any fear in the eyes of the Spanish as they passed us by. Are we not king's men?" And then we have a really like, "Aye," a powerful shout from them all. And then Barbossa just says, "Aye, hands all off and bear away. Stay on ahead to White Cap Bay." And then we leave the Providence to go back over to the Queen Anne's Revenge, where we have a really great scene here between Jack and Angelica. Honestly, one of the highlights of the film for me. It's a very great scene between these two. But Angelica comes up on deck, and we see Jack is sitting on a cannon. Scrum is on the stairs, kind of strumming his guitar. But I love how Jack pronounces Ola. He's like, Hola, come, little drink. And he gets off the cannon and he grabs the bottle from inside of the cannon. But Angelica's like, wine, music, candlelight. I think we've traveled down this road before, Jack. And then Jack's like, yes, we have. And he throws her a chalice, and he's like, I remember it well. Winding, twisting, and turning, gyrating, writhing. Incessant writhing. And then he puts his arm up, kind of gesturing to that kind of cloth that's on his left wrist. And that's actually been on his wrist, if you remember, since we met him, since we saw Jack in Curse of the Black Pearl, this kind of like wrap has been on his left wrist, and we've just never known what it was. But now we finally get the confirmation that is from the time of him and Angelica being a thing. And he holds his arm up and shows her it. He's like, do you remember Saint Dominique? And then Angelica corrects him, and he's like, La Martinique. I tried to kill you in Saint Dominique. And then Jack's like, either or. But it's really cool how we kind of get, description of what kind of some of these things mean on Jack's person. So it's neat to finally get, what was that for? That's been on Jack forever since we saw him in Curse of the Black Pearl. So it's cool to get kind of like official confirmation of like what some of these things are. But Angelica just says, hardly appropriate for a first mate. And then Jack just says, was I the first? I've often wondered. And then Angelica just says, you can be so charming when you want something, Jack. The trick is finding out what. And then we see Scrum begins to strum the guitar a bit harder. We get kind of more of a music kind of going on in the background here as this kind of tango scene begins. But Jack says, the truth, then, is it? Blackbeard has served his purpose. You and I can go to the fountain together, where we shall bathe one another in the equal shares of fame and other assorted debaucheries. And we see Angelica and Jack are starting to dance here on the deck. And as you can tell already, this is a very, I guess I'll just say it's a very sexy scene. And I think one of the big reasons why this scene is even kind of like this is Rob Marshall, who directed this film. He has directed a lot of musicals. I mean, if you think about Rob Marshall, I think he's most known for the musicals that he has directed. And, he loves dance, he loves song. That's why he directs so many musicals. So I'm guessing this is probably one of those scenes that Rob Marshall probably had some more input in. And it is a great scene. It is great seeing some great chemistry between Jack and Angelica. And it's cool because it does kind of border the lines on, what can you really get in a family-friendly kind of Disney movie, despite it being a PG-13 movie. Of course, I mean, we had, if this doesn't really hold a candle to what we had at the end of At World's End with Will and Elizabeth on the beach, but that's a different story. But Angelica says, and I'll tell you the ritual of the fountain. And then Jack's like, yes, the profane ritual. And of course, this is the scene where we find out what this whole ritual is. And then Angelica says, can I trust you, Jack? I need you on my side. And then Jack kind of gets right down on top of Angelica on the deck. And he's like, oh, my dearest Angelica. You and I are as thick as thieves, love. And he's like, tell me the rules. And they are very close. Angelica's literally laying on the ground. Jack is literally on top of her. And she just says, water from the fountain of youth. And then she rolls over and throws Jack on the ground and gets on top of Jack. And then she says, the shimmering tear of a mermaid. And she's kind of like touching his face. And we're getting a great Jack Sparrow reaction from this sensation that he's getting here. But Angelica keeps continuing and says, the silver chalices of Ponce de Leon. And then Jack's like, oh. And of course, Angelica's right up on his ear, whispering into his ear. Like, we're getting some very sensual stuff here. And Angelica whispers into his ear, with these items. Yes. And she repeats, with these items, you may take all the years of life from another, Jack. And then Jack immediately snaps out of it and sits up and looks at her. And he's like, eh? And Angelica says, you know what that means. We cannot go alone, you and I. The ritual requires a victim. And then Jack's like, that is unfortunate. And Angelica's like, yes, it is. And Jack's like, I find my desire for the fountain greatly lessened. And Jack kind of lays back onto the deck again. Angelica gets back on top of him. And she just says, but there is something on board you do want. And then we go over to the next scene here. And we'll probably cover this on another deleted scene episode, but there is a more extended version of that scene with more of like a dancing portion of it. That is one of the deleted scenes from this movie, and we'll probably do another deleted scene episode for both On Shooter Tides and Dead Men Tell No Tales, as they don't have... There's probably like 10, if you add both of the movies' scenes up, there's probably 10. So we'll probably just do one episode for both these films later on. Maybe at the end of the season. Maybe next season. We'll find out. But next scene we have is a really cool scene where Angelica takes Jack into Blackbeard's cabin. And she opens up these locked grates in front of this cabinet. And Jack's like, what about Blackbeard? And Angelica says, he's in the chart room. We'll have to be quick. But she opens up this cabinet, and what we get the reveal of is all of these bottles that all have ships in them. So we have ship in a bottles. We have so many ships in bottles. We have many ships in bottles. And this is cool because, I mean, a ship in a bottle is a very kind of like iconic, like nautical symbol. It's something that, you know, very iconic. When you think of a ship in a bottle, you know exactly what someone means by that. But we haven't seen like a ship in a bottle or kind of something akin to that in Pirates of the Caribbean before. So it's really cool to see, you know, ships in bottles. And these aren't just ordinary ships in bottles, like for display. No, there is something special about these ships in bottles. But Jack goes up and he sees all these ships, and he sees that they're all still alive, so to speak, and that the water inside the bottles is actually moving. It's alive, and the ships are alive. You can see, he sees like activity on the ships, like some of the ships are firing off cannons. Angelica tells him he keeps each ship as a prize. You help me, and I promise you your pick. And Jack is kind of looking at all these ships here. But Angelica says, though I know the one you will choose. And then Jack finds in one of these bottles his beloved Black Pearl. So we now know what happened to the Black Pearl. Of course, you know, up to this point, Jack thought the Black Pearl actually did sink. That's kind of the notion that he gets from Barbossa at the beginning of the movie. But now he knows that the ship, the Pearl is still alive. It's just in this bottle. How to get it out, we won't find out till the next movie. But the Black Pearl is still alive, and you can see it crashing on the waves here in this bottle. And he's like, the Black Pearl in a bottle? Why is the Black Pearl in a bottle? But then he sees inside the bottle, he can see a miniature Jack the Monkey in the bottle. And Jack the Monkey yells out at Jack, and Jack kind of like gets scared and moves back. And Jack's like, he's even more annoying in miniature. But it also explains where Jack the Monkey is in this movie. Of course, Jack the Monkey comes back in the next movie, but of course, Jack the Monkey is just stuck in the bottle with the ship. But Angelica walks in front of Jack to get his attention, and she says, do we have a deal, Jack? And Jack's like, Angelica, I know you. You are not going to steal the life of some innocent man. And then Angelica just says, what about the one-legged man? and she closes the bottle closet, as I'll call it, and she says, "I need years, Jack. Not for me, for my father." And then she tells Jack, "I am truly the daughter of Blackbeard," to kind of make Jack actually believe this is the thing, because Jack is still not, he doesn't believe it. And Jack just says, "You've fallen for your own con, love." And then Angelica says, "No, he is my father. The lies I told you were not lies." And then Jack's like, "Wait, you lied to me by telling me the truth?" And then Angelica's like, "Yes." And then Jack's like, "That's very good. May I use that?" And then Angelica's like, "I'm sure you will anyway." And then Jack's like, "Oh, of course I will." And he's like, "So will you not give up this quest?" And then Angelica tells him, like, "I want a father, Jack. I haven't had one." And then Jack's like, "Angelica, your father, Blackbeard, he is evil, and he will kill you given the chance." And we see Angelica grabs the Jack Sparrow voodoo doll off the table. And Jack says, "He cannot be saved." And Angelica says, "And who are you to tell me the limits on redemption? You stole years of my life, Jack. You owe me." And Jack says, "And you are en route to getting yourself killed." And he goes down to her hand to try to grab the Jack Sparrow voodoo doll from her hand. And then Angelica recoils as they both hear someone on deck shouting, "Whitecap Bay," ringing the bell. And this scene ends, and we arrive at Whitecap Bay, the mysterious Whitecap Bay. And we will find out what Whitecap Bay is, what it entails, what's going on here. We'll find out next episode. Because we're already 83 minutes in before I've edited this episode, so that is where we will stop today. We will continue our quest through On Stranger Tides on the next episode. So I hope you have enjoyed this episode, as I hope you've enjoyed other episodes of the podcast. I hope you continue to listen as we make our way through On Stranger Tides. If you're new here, if you're just finding this episode first for some reason, I hope you've enjoyed, and I hope you go back and listen to all the other episodes we've done, especially if you're a Pirates of the Caribbean fan. I hope you'll like this podcast. But as I'm saying that, if you have enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating or a review wherever you're listening to the podcast on. It greatly helps the podcast. It gets boosted up in the searches so people can find it easier. And overall, it helps the podcast in many, many ways. So if you could do that, I'd greatly appreciate it if you would leave a rating or a review. But that'll be it for this episode. I'll see you back here next time as we continue on to Whitecap Bay in On Stranger Tides. So I will see you all soon on Podcast of the Caribbean. Take care. Podcast of the Caribbean is in no way affiliated with Disney. If you want to send me an email or a question, you can send it over to podcastofthecaribbean@gmail.com. You can also follow this podcast on Instagram at Podcast of the Caribbean, and also on Twitter at PodcastPOTC. I'll be posting content, other fun trivia stuff over there. Make sure you go check those platforms out. But be sure to keep a weather eye on the horizon, and always remember, dead men tell no tales.